There's a moment when you realize you've been living your entire life as a performance. Like an actor who's forgotten they're on stage, you've been so busy playing the role of the agreeable one, the helpful one, the one who never rocks the boat, that you've lost track of who you actually are beneath all that desperate need to be liked. Carl Jung understood this profound psychological prison better than most. He called it living behind the persona, that carefully constructed mask we wear to gain social approval. But what Jung discovered, and what transforms everything, is what happens when you finally have the courage to take that mask off. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you said no without immediately following it with an apology? When did you last express a genuine opinion that might make someone uncomfortable? If you're struggling to remember, you're not alone. You're part of the majority who have traded their authentic self for the illusion of universal acceptance. But here's what Jung knew, and what changes everything once you understand it. People-pleasing isn't actually about pleasing people. It's about avoiding the terror of being truly seen, judged, and potentially rejected for who you really are. It's a defense mechanism so sophisticated that it masquerades as kindness. Picture this. You're standing in front of a mirror that's been covered with layer upon layer of paint, each coat representing another compromise you've made, another piece of yourself you've hidden to avoid conflict. The people-pleaser spends their life adding more paint, thinking they're creating something beautiful. But Jung would tell you that true beauty, true authenticity, comes from stripping away every single layer until you can see your reflection clearly again. The moment you decide to stop people-pleasing is like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. Everything you thought you knew about yourself and your relationships begins to shift. It's terrifying and liberating in equal measure. You know that feeling, right? That moment when you realize you've been agreeing to things you don't want to do, laughing at jokes you don't find funny, and nodding along to conversations that bore you to tears, all because somewhere deep down you believed that your authentic self wasn't worthy of love. Jung called this the process of individuation, the journey from living as society expects you to living as your soul demands you to live. It's not a gentle transition. It's more like a psychological earthquake that shakes the very foundations of how you've been existing in the world. When you first stop people-pleasing, something remarkable happens. The world doesn't end. People don't abandon you en masse. The sky doesn't fall. Instead, something far more profound occurs. You begin to discover who you've been all along underneath all that performance. But let's be honest about what this process actually looks like, because Jung never sugar-coated the difficulties of psychological growth. When you stop automatically saying yes to everything, some people will be confused. They've grown accustomed to your compliance. They've built their relationship with you around the assumption that you'll always be available, always agreeable, always willing to bend to their needs. This is like watching a carefully choreographed dance suddenly change tempo. Some dances will adapt, finding new steps that work with your authentic rhythm. Others will stumble, frustrated that the music has changed. A few will leave the dance floor entirely, unable to adjust to this new version of you. And that's when you learn one of Jung's most important lessons. Not all relationships are meant to survive your awakening. Some connections were built on the foundation of your self-abandonment. When you remove that foundation by choosing authenticity over approval, these relationships naturally dissolve. Let me ask you something else. Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is to constantly monitor other people's reactions to your words and actions? People pleasers become masters of reading micro-expressions, detecting the slightest shift in tone, always scanning for signs of disapproval. It's like being a full-time emotional detective, except you're investigating whether you're allowed to exist as you are. When you stop people-pleasing, this hypervigilance begins to fade. You stop contorting yourself to fit into the emotional shape others want you to take. Instead, you begin to occupy your own space with confidence. You speak your truth not because you're sure everyone will like it, but because it's yours to speak. Jung understood that this shift creates what he called shadow integration. All those opinions you've been suppressing, all those boundaries you've been afraid to set, all those aspects of yourself you've deemed unacceptable, they don't disappear just because you've been hiding them. They live in your psychological shadow, growing stronger in the darkness. Picture your shadow as a room in your house that you kept locked for years. You've told yourself it's better to leave it unopened, that whatever is in there is too dangerous or unacceptable to acknowledge. But Jung discovered that what we don't integrate owns us. Those locked away parts of yourself don't remain dormant. They influence your behavior in unconscious ways. When you stop people-pleasing, you're essentially unlocking that room and discovering that it's not filled with monsters after all. It's filled with the disowned parts of yourself, your legitimate anger, your healthy selfishness, your right to take up space, your permission to disappoint others in service of your own growth. This is like finding a treasure chest you buried so deep you forgot where you put it. Inside, you rediscover your capacity for discernment, your ability to say, "This feels right," or "This doesn't work for me." You remember that you have preferences, opinions, and needs that are valid simply because they're yours. But here's where it gets really interesting, and where Jung's insights become revolutionary. As you integrate these shadow aspects and stop people-pleasing, you don't become selfish or uncaring. You become more genuinely generous. When you give from a place of authentic choice rather than compulsive compliance, your gifts carry more meaning. You know that feeling when someone helps you not because they feel obligated, but because they genuinely want to? That's the energy you begin to embody when you stop people-pleasing. Your yes becomes more valuable because it's not automatic. Your presence becomes more meaningful because it's not guaranteed. Jung would say you're moving from what he called collective values to individual values. Instead of living by the rules that society, your family, or your peer group has imposed, you begin to develop your own internal compass. This compass doesn't ignore the needs of others, but it doesn't sacrifice your essence to meet those needs either. This process is like learning to speak your native language for the first time. You've been speaking everyone else's language for so long that you've forgotten you have your own. When you first try to express your authentic thoughts and feelings, it might feel awkward, uncertain, but with practice, you begin to find your voice. And then something beautiful happens. The people who truly matter in your life, the ones capable of real connection, they don't just accept this new version of you, they celebrate it. They've been waiting for you to show up authentically because they can sense the difference between performance and presence. These relationships deepen in ways that surprise you. When you stop people pleasing, you create space for others to be authentic too. You're no longer playing the role of the perpetual accommodator, which means others don't have to play complementary roles either. Real intimacy becomes possible. Let me ask you this. Have you ever considered that your people-pleasing might actually be a form of control? Jung recognized that what appears to be selfless behavior often masks a deep need to manage how others perceive us. When you're constantly adjusting your behavior to avoid disapproval, you're trying to control other people's emotions and reactions. When you stop people-pleasing, you're essentially saying, I cannot control how you feel about me, and I'm finally okay with that. This is like releasing a rope you've been pulling with all your strength. Suddenly, your hands are free to do other things, to create, to reach toward what you actually want. This liberation from the need to manage others' emotions is profound. You begin to realize that other people's reactions to your authenticity are not your responsibility. Their disappointment, their anger, their confusion, these are their emotions to process, not yours to prevent. Jung understood that this boundary between self and other is crucial for psychological health. When you stop people-pleasing, you're essentially rebuilding this boundary. You're saying, this is where I end and you begin. I am responsible for my feelings and choices, and you are responsible for yours. This shift is like watching a river that's been diverted for years suddenly find its natural course again. There's a power in this return to your authentic flow that affects everything around you. You become a catalyst for others' authenticity, simply by example. But let's talk about the fear that keeps most people trapped in the people-pleasing cycle. It's the terror of being disliked, rejected, or abandoned. Jung called this the fear of psychological death, the ego's conviction that if we're not constantly pleasing others, we'll be cast out from the tribe and perish. This fear made sense in our evolutionary past when tribal rejection could mean actual death. But in our modern world, it's an outdated survival mechanism that's keeping us from truly living. When you stop people-pleasing, you're essentially facing this primal fear and discovering that it's largely illusory. You know that moment when you realize you've been afraid of something that wasn't actually dangerous? That's what happens when you stop people-pleasing. You discover that the people who truly matter will still be there when you show up authentically. And the ones who leave? They were never really connecting with you anyway. They were connecting with your performance. This realization is like watching a magic trick being revealed. What seemed so mysterious and threatening, the possibility of disapproval, turns out to be just another human emotion, no more dangerous than any other. You can survive it. You can even thrive despite it. Jung emphasized that this process of individuation isn't about becoming isolated or selfish. It's about becoming sovereign, able to make choices from your own center rather than in reaction to others' expectations. This sovereignty is what allows for genuine relationship. When you stop people-pleasing, you begin to attract people who are drawn to your authenticity rather than your compliance. These connections have a different quality. They're based on mutual respect and genuine affinity, rather than need and accommodation. Picture this. Instead of being a chameleon that changes colors to match everyone else's expectations, you become like a lighthouse, steady, consistent, offering your own light without apology. Some ships will be drawn to your beacon, others will navigate toward different shores. Both responses are perfectly fine. This is when you start to understand what Jung meant when he talked about the privilege of a lifetime being to become who you truly are. It's not a privilege because it's easy or comfortable. It's a privilege because it's the only way to live a life that's genuinely yours. But here's something Jung observed that's particularly important for people pleasers to understand. When you stop automatically accommodating others, you don't become less loving. You become more discriminating about where you direct your love. Your care becomes more intentional, more meaningful. You know that feeling when you give someone a gift that you carefully chose specifically for them, versus grabbing something generic at the last minute. That's the difference between authentic care and people-pleasing. When you stop people-pleasing, your care becomes more thoughtful, more targeted, more valuable. This discrimination isn't cruelty, it's wisdom. Jung understood that we have limited emotional energy, and when we spread it thin by trying to please everyone, we have nothing substantial to offer anyone. When you stop people-pleasing, you become capable of deeper, more meaningful connections. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how people-pleasers often attract people who are comfortable taking advantage of others' generosity? This isn't coincidence. Jung would say, it's the shadow's way of teaching us about boundaries. When you stop people-pleasing, these dynamics shift dramatically. The people who were drawn to your automatic compliance often lose interest. Meanwhile, individuals who value mutual respect and authentic connection begin to appear in your life. It's like changing the frequency on a radio. Different stations become available. This change in your social environment is one of the most striking aspects of stopping people-pleasing. You realize that your compliance wasn't actually making you more likable to the people who matter. It was making you more useful to people who don't value you as a person. Jung called this phenomenon psychological gravitation. We tend to attract what we are, not what we want. When you're people-pleasing, you're broadcasting a signal that says, I'll abandon myself to make you comfortable. This attracts people who are looking for someone to do exactly that. When you stop people-pleasing, you begin broadcasting a different signal. I respect myself, and I respect you enough to be honest. This attracts people who are capable of handling honesty and authenticity in relationship. This shift is like moving from a swamp to a mountain stream. The ecosystem changes completely. The relationships that flourish in your new environment are cleaner, clearer, more life-giving. But Jung was honest about the challenges of this transition. There's often a period of loneliness as old relationships fall away and new ones haven't yet formed. This is what he called the dark night of the soul, a necessary passage in the journey toward authenticity. During this time, you might question whether you made the right choice. The people-pleasing voice in your head might whisper, "See, you're alone now. You should have kept everyone happy." But Jung would tell you, this loneliness is not a sign of failure, it's a sign of growth. Picture this loneliness as the pause between movements in a symphony. It's not empty space, it's the silence that gives meaning to the music that comes before and after. This solitude is where you remember who you are when you're not performing for others. You know that feeling when you're finally alone after a long day of social interaction and you can just breathe. That's a taste of what this deeper solitude offers. It's not loneliness, it's homecoming. You're returning to yourself. Jung understood that this return to the self is necessary for any authentic relationship. You cannot truly connect with others if you don't know who you are. People-pleasing is essentially trying to connect from a place of inner emptiness, hoping others will fill the void. When you stop people-pleasing, you begin to fill that void yourself. You develop what Jung called self-holding, the ability to be your own source of validation and comfort. This doesn't make you independent of others, but it makes you able to relate to others from a place of fullness rather than need. This shift is like the difference between being a leak in a bucket and being a spring. The leak is constantly trying to draw water from outside sources to fill itself. The spring generates its own water from within and naturally overflows to nourish everything around it. When you become spring-like in your relationships, everything changes. You're no longer desperately seeking approval because you're generating your own sense of worth. You're no longer afraid of conflict because you're not dependent on others' happiness for your own stability. Let me ask you this. Have you ever considered that people-pleasing might be a form of dishonesty? Jung certainly saw it that way. When you automatically agree with others to avoid conflict, you're lying about your true thoughts and feelings. When you say yes, when you mean no, you're deceiving both yourself and others. This dishonesty, however well-intentioned, creates what Jung called psychological inflation, a disconnection from reality. You begin to lose touch with your authentic responses because you've been overriding them for so long. When you stop people-pleasing, you're essentially committing to radical honesty. Not brutal honesty that disregards others' feelings, but honest honesty that honors both your truth and others' dignity. This is like cleaning a window that's been clouded with years of grime. Suddenly, you can see clearly again. This clarity affects every aspect of your life. You begin to make decisions based on your actual values rather than what you think others want to hear. You choose activities that genuinely interest you rather than ones that make you look good. You speak words that reflect your true thoughts rather than words designed to placate. Jung observed that this alignment between inner truth and outer expression creates what he called psychological coherence. When your thoughts, feelings, and actions are aligned, you emit a different kind of energy. People sense this coherence even if they can't articulate what's different about you. This coherence is like tuning an instrument that's been out of tune for years. Suddenly, the music you make is clear, resonant, powerful. Others are drawn to this clarity because it reminds them of their own potential for authenticity. But here's something particularly important that Jung understood about stopping people-pleasing. It's not about becoming aggressive or uncaring. It's about becoming authentic. There's a crucial difference between healthy boundaries and hostile walls. When you stop people-pleasing, you're not shutting people out. You're inviting them into a more honest relationship. You're saying, I care about you enough to be real with you. I respect you enough to trust that you can handle my authenticity. This is like the difference between giving someone a plastic flower and giving them a real one. The plastic flower will never wilt or cause allergies, but it will never truly nourish either. The real flower might have thorns, might be imperfect, but it's alive, fragrant, capable of bringing actual joy. When you stop people-pleasing, you're offering others the gift of your authentic self, thorns and all. Some people will appreciate this gift. Others will prefer the plastic version, and that's okay. Jung would say that's information about their capacity for real relationship, not a judgment on your worth. You know that feeling when someone shares something real and vulnerable with you and you feel honored by their trust? That's what you're offering when you stop people-pleasing. You're trusting others with your genuine self rather than protecting them from it. This trust is revolutionary because it breaks the cycle of mutual deception that characterizes so many relationships. When you show up authentically, you give others permission to do the same. You become a catalyst for collective authenticity. Jung called this phenomenon psychological contagion. Authenticity spreads. When one person in a group or relationship system stops people-pleasing and begins showing up genuinely, it creates ripple effects. Others begin to feel safer being real too. This is like lighting a candle in a dark room. The darkness doesn't fight the light, it simply reveals itself to be an absence rather than a presence. Similarly, when you stop people-pleasing, you're not fighting against falseness. You're revealing it to be unnecessary. But let's talk about what happens to your relationship with yourself when you stop people-pleasing. This might be the most profound shift of all. For years, you've been abandoning yourself to accommodate others. You've been treating your own needs, feelings, and desires as less important than everyone else's. When you stop people-pleasing, you begin to develop what Jung called self-compassion, the ability to treat yourself with the same kindness you've been offering others. You start to listen to your own needs, to honor your own boundaries, to validate your own experiences. This self-compassion is like finally having a friend who's always on your side. You stop being your own worst critic and become your own wise advocate. You learn to speak to yourself with the same gentleness you'd use with a beloved child. This shift in self-relationship changes everything. When you're no longer your own enemy, you stop needing others to be your constant validators. When you're no longer abandoning yourself, you stop fearing abandonment from others. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how people-pleasers often feel resentful despite their apparent selflessness? Jung understood this paradox. When you constantly override your own needs to meet others' expectations, resentment builds like water behind a dam. When you stop people-pleasing, you're essentially opening the floodgates of this accumulated resentment. At first, this might feel overwhelming. You might be surprised by how angry you are about all the times you said yes when you meant no, all the times you smiled when you wanted to scream. But Jung saw this anger as healthy. It's your psyche's way of reclaiming your power. This anger isn't meant to be directed at others, though you might feel that initially. It's meant to fuel your commitment to never abandon yourself again. This process is like a river that's been dammed for years, suddenly breaking free. The initial rush might be turbulent, but eventually the river finds its natural course and flows with power and purpose. As you process this accumulated resentment, something remarkable happens. You begin to forgive not just others, but yourself. You forgive yourself for all the years you spent hiding. You forgive others for taking advantage of your compliance. You forgive the whole system that taught you to value others' comfort over your own authenticity. This forgiveness isn't about condoning harmful behavior. It's about releasing the psychic energy that's been tied up in old grievances so you can use it for creating something new. Jung called this psychological liberation, freedom from the past's grip on your present choices. When you stop people-pleasing, you also begin to understand the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is feeling bad about something you've done. Shame is feeling bad about who you are. People pleasers often carry enormous amounts of shame disguised as guilt. You might feel guilty about disappointing someone, but underneath that guilt is often shame about being the kind of person who would disappoint others. When you stop people pleasing, you begin to separate these experiences. You can feel appropriate guilt about specific actions while releasing the toxic shame about your essential worth. This distinction is like learning to separate weather from climate. Guilt is whether it comes and goes based on specific circumstances. Shame is climate, it colors everything. When you stop people pleasing, you begin to change your internal climate from one of self-rejection to one of self-acceptance. You know that feeling when you realize you've been carrying something heavy for so long that you forgot it was there? That's what happens when you release the shame that's been driving your people-pleasing. Suddenly, you have so much more energy available for living. Jung understood that this energy isn't meant to be hoarded. It's meant to be channeled into what he called authentic service, giving to others from a place of genuine choice rather than compulsive compliance. When you stop people-pleasing, you don't stop caring about others. You start caring more skillfully. This is like the difference between throwing money randomly at every cause you encounter and making thoughtful donations to organizations you truly support. When you stop people-pleasing, your care becomes more focused, more intentional, more effective. But here's something Jung observed that's particularly important for former people-pleasers to understand. Authenticity doesn't mean you have to share every thought and feeling with everyone. Discernment is part of wisdom. When you stop people-pleasing, you're not committing to radical transparency with everyone in your life. You're committing to radical honesty with yourself about what you think, feel, and want. Then you can choose consciously how much to share with whom. This is like having a well-stocked library in your home. You don't have to lend every book to every visitor, but you know what you have, and you can choose what to share based on each person's interests and trustworthiness. This discernment is actually a form of respect both for yourself and for others. Not everyone is equipped to handle your deepest truths, and that's okay. Part of stopping people-pleasing is learning to match your level of sharing to each person's capacity for receiving. Let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to naturally command respect, while others, often people-pleasers, struggle to get it? Jung would say, it's because respect is earned through self-respect, not through self-sacrifice. When you stop people-pleasing, you begin to embody what Jung called quiet dignity, a way of being that commands respect without demanding it. This dignity comes from knowing your worth and refusing to negotiate it for others' comfort. This dignity is like a tuning fork that resonates at a frequency of self-respect. Others can feel this frequency even if they can't name it. They begin to treat you differently, not because you're demanding different treatment, but because you're embodying a different standard. People who used to take advantage of your compliance suddenly find themselves being more respectful. People who used to dismiss your opinions start listening more carefully. It's not magic, it's psychology. When you treat yourself with respect, you teach others how to treat you. This shift is like moving from a position of begging to a position of negotiating. When you're people-pleasing, you're essentially begging for acceptance. When you stop, you're negotiating from a position of inherent worth. Jung understood that this transformation in how others treat you is often the most surprising aspect of stopping people pleasing. You expect to lose relationships, but you don't expect existing relationships to improve. Yet that's often exactly what happens. When you stop people pleasing, you give others the gift of clarity. They no longer have to guess what you really think or feel. They know where they stand with you. This clarity creates a foundation for deeper, more authentic connection. This is like replacing a wobbly table with a solid one. Suddenly, everyone can relax and enjoy the meal because they're not constantly worried about everything falling over. Your consistency and authenticity create a sense of safety that actually draws people closer. But Jung was clear about one thing. This process of stopping people pleasing isn't a destination, it's a practice. Even after you've made significant progress, you'll still encounter situations that trigger your old patterns. The difference is that now you have awareness and choice. You know that feeling when you catch yourself about to fall back into an old habit, but you pause and choose differently. That's what recovery from people-pleasing looks like. It's not perfection, it's conscious choice-making. This ongoing practice is like tending a garden. You don't plant once and never need to weed again. You keep showing up, keep choosing authenticity over approval. Keep honoring your truth even when it's uncomfortable. Each time you choose authenticity over people-pleasing, you strengthen what Jung called your psychological immune system, your capacity to resist external pressure to abandon yourself. Like physical immunity, it gets stronger with practice. And here's something beautiful that Jung observed. As you become more authentic, you begin to inspire authenticity in others, not through preaching or pushing, but through modeling. People see the peace and power that comes from living aligned with your truth, and they want that for themselves. This inspiration is like a ripple effect in a pond. Your authenticity touches the people closest to you, and they begin to be more authentic with the people in their lives, and so on. You become part of a larger movement toward genuine human connection. But perhaps the most profound thing that happens when you stop people-pleasing is this. You begin to trust yourself. For years, you've been overriding your own instincts, second-guessing your own perceptions, deferring to others' opinions about what's best for you. When you stop people-pleasing, you start to rebuild what Jung called inner authority, the ability to be your own guide, your own validator, your own source of wisdom. This doesn't mean you never seek input from others, but it means you're the final authority on your own life. This inner authority is like having a compass that always points toward your true north. External circumstances might be stormy, others might try to convince you to go in different directions, but you always know which way is home. You know that feeling when you're trying to remember something that's right on the tip of your tongue, and suddenly it comes to you. That's what rebuilding inner authority feels like. You're remembering something you always knew, but had forgotten that you are the expert on your own life. This remembering is profound because it reconnects you with what Jung called your essential self, the part of you that exists beyond all roles, expectations, and performances. This self has been waiting patiently for you to return, like a lighthouse that never stops shining, even when ships aren't looking for it. When you stop people-pleasing, you're essentially sailing back toward that lighthouse. You're coming home to yourself after years of being lost at sea, trying to navigate by other people's stars. And here's what Jung knew. That changes everything. You've always been the one you've been waiting for. The approval you've been seeking from others, the validation you've been desperate for, the sense of worth you've been trying to earn, it's all been inside you all along. This isn't New Age wishful thinking. This is psychological reality. When you stop people-pleasing, you're not becoming someone new. You're uncovering who you've always been beneath all the layers of performance and pretense. This uncovering is like an archaeological dig, where you're both the archaeologist and the treasure. Each layer of people-pleasing you remove reveals more of your authentic self. Each boundary you set uncovers more of your true power. Each time you choose your truth over others' comfort, you excavate another piece of your essential being. The person you discover isn't perfect. They have flaws, limitations, difficult emotions, but they're real. They're yours. They're home. And when you finally stop people-pleasing, when you finally choose to live from this place of authenticity rather than performance, something extraordinary happens. You don't just find yourself, you find your people. The ones who love you not despite your imperfections, but because of your courage to be imperfect out loud. You've always been the one you've been waiting for. Now finally, you see it.